of Scripture, there is a letter written to Cyrus by name. God says, because I'm calling you by name, even though you don't know who I am, you will thus know that I'm the God of Israel. And the scroll was written 150 years earlier. And by the way, the person, according to, I think it's the Talmud, or Josephus, I forget which, that presents the scroll to Cyrus is none other than Daniel. And Cyrus is obviously impressed. I think we all would be, wouldn't you? Find a letter 150 years old calling you by name. And by the way, getting the highlights of your career and some other things. And so Cyrus is impressed. It's a matter of history that he is, and he releases the Jews to go home. Now, what's interesting about this is it's the very day, 70 days, that the captivity started. That's a whole study, but when you go through all that arithmetic, you discover it's the exact day. Now, there's another detail of all of this that I think is worth your consideration. There's a passage in Ezekiel, chapter 4, and for time reasons, we'll go into all the details now. But the gist of it is that God says through Ezekiel that there'll be 430 years of judgment on Israel. Now, 70 of those 430 years we know about. That's the Babylonian captivity. If you take 70 from 430, that leaves you 360 years of judgment predicted upon Israel, and those 360 years don't fit any particular passage of history. It's an awkward interpretive problem. It has been suggested by several that in Leviticus chapter 26, there's 4 different places where God says, in effect, that if you don't obey me the first time, I'll multiply your punishments by 7. Oh, another piece of history you need to have to get background here. When Nebuchadnezzar does his first siege, and he makes them all vassals of Babylon and takes some of them slaves, the prophets, that is, I should say, Ezekiel and Jeremiah, preach to the people that Nebuchadnezzar is the instrument of God, that this is God's judgment off the nation. The false prophets surrounding the leadership say, nonsense, we're God's chosen people and God's going to deliver us. And that was a more popular message. Jeremiah says, no, God has told me to tell you that don't expect to be delivered. You're in for 70 years of captivity. And by the way, if you don't yield, God is going to destroy Jerusalem. Well, to make a long story short, Jehoiakim says nonsense. He rebels. Nebuchadnezzar lays a second siege on Babylon, succeeds, replaces Jehoiakim with Zedekiah, and goes back home. And again, Ezekiel writing from Babylon and Jeremiah writing in Jerusalem tells Zedekiah, don't rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. He's the hand of God, in effect. They couldn't swallow that. They're Jewish. He's Gentile. God is going to deliver us and so forth. No. So they rebel also. And by this time, Nebuchadnezzar has a belly full of the whole operation. He sends his troops and not only lays siege, he levels the place, destroys Jerusalem, takes them all slaves. That's the third siege of Nebuchadnezzar. The reason I'm getting into these technicalities is, in the Old Testament, there are 2 phrases. One is, the servitude of the nation is to be 70 years long, and it was to the very day. It starts from the first siege of Nebuchadnezzar. There's also a phrase, and Daniel uses it and elsewhere, of the desolations of Jerusalem, and they were predicted by Jeremiah to be 70 years long. And because they both smack of the captivity and they're both 70 years long, most scholars treat the servitude of the nation and the desolations of Jerusalem as if they were synonyms. Now, the reason I'm getting into this is this peculiar passage, I guess 10, 15 years ago, this peculiar passage of Ezekiel bothered me. The 430 years less 70, the 360 years. And I ran into this idea that, Leviticus says 4 times that if you don't obey me the first time, I'll multiply your punishment by 7. Well, if you multiply 360 by 7, you get 2,520 years. And several commentators have noted that that's about the duration of the diaspora. That is, from the Babylon captivity coming back, by the time you go through Rome and the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and all that, the Jews get scattered throughout the world. That's been roughly a little over 2,000, call it 2,500 years. Well, I'm always bothered by that. First of all, the whole length seemed a little contrived, but then also there's nothing approximate in God's plan. If we're understanding correct, it's precise to the very day. But what no one had bothered to do was to take the 2,520 years and recognize that God deals in 360-day years for lots of reasons. Sir Robert Anderson discovered that and thus unraveled the Daniel 9, the 70-week prophecy of Daniel and all of that. But no one ever applied that here. So I thought, well, gee, what's 2,520 years if you take 360-day years, the solar year? And that's 907,200 days. You say, Chuck, that's wonderful. What do I do with that? Well, what you need to do is say, okay, what's that in our calendar? Well, that means you've got the Julian year is about 11 minutes and 10.46 seconds longer than the mean solar year. And what that all means is you end up having 3 leap years too many every 4 centuries. So, and they recognized this in 1752 AD. They realized they had an 11-day error in our Julian calendar. there was 11 days too many, so they made the 3rd of September of 1752 the 14th of September. In other words, got rid of 11 days, so to speak. They also decided that 1700, 1800, and 1900 will be common years, not leap years. The year 2000 will be a leap year. The point is, they corrected this minor anomaly in our leap year calculations to get the mean solar year in step with this idea of the year and all of that. Well, you say, gee, what do you do with the 2,520 years? I mean, that's 907,200 days. How many years and days is that in our calendar? Well, it turns out that's 2,483 years. And you have to go through some corrections for the leap years. And without taking you through all of that, it turns out that the 2,520 years, by multiplying it out, becomes on our calendar 2,483 years, 9 months, and 21 days. And you say, gee, Chuck, that's really exciting. What do I do with that? Well, your next problem is, okay, when do you start counting? Well, it's interesting because the servitude of the nation started with the first siege of Nebuchadnezzar, and it lasted 70 years. But remember, those are 360-day years, so that's actually 69 years and 2 days. That means that ended on July 23rd of 537 BC. And if you count 2,483 years, 9 months and 21 days, from the servitude of the nation, Israel, you come to May 14th of 1948, the very day that David Ben-Gurion announced to the world that the new Jewish homeland was going to be called Israel. May 14th of 1948. All the arguments that we're still going through, I appear on KKLA and get into a talk show, and the amillennialists crawl out of the woodwork. You take the Bible literally. I says, I take the Bible seriously. And they didn't know how to deal with that one. But all those arguments should have ended on May 14th of 1948, because up till then you could argue this, that, and the other thing. But hey, Israel is. It's there. Go visit it. See it. Feel it. And they're going to start building the temple. Come on, get serious, gang. But that's interesting. I don't want to oversell this. The point is, that's an interesting situation. There are lots of controversies about the details I'm going through. I'm not boring you with all that stuff right now. But it's interesting, if you count this period of time that Ezekiel predicts from the servitude of the nation's completion, you come to May 14th of 1948. Okay. And I say, what a coincidence. And the rabbis say, coincidence is not a kosher word.